LiSTNR production.
A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of family and domestic violence. Please listen with care. Welcome to Crime Insiders Forensics. For those joining us for the first time, my name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. This week, the disturbing psychology of stalking.
Stalking itself is a real problem and it can be massively harmful regardless of whether it involves physical violence or not.
Professor Troy McEwan is one of Australia's leading forensic psychologists who specialises in understanding, assessing and treating stalking behaviour. The complexities of this important issue, combined with Troy's significant expertise, are near impossible to condense into a single episode. So, this discussion is part 1 of 2. In this first part, you'll hear about the 5 different types of stalker and gain an insight into the psychology behind their problematic behaviours.
So when you look at homicide cases, stalking's really common amongst ex-partners. But when you look at stalking cases, homicide's really, really, really unusual.
To begin, Troy reveals the one motivation shared by almost all stalkers.
For most people who stalk, they want to be known to the victim. For most people who stalk, it's not about being secretive and anonymous. There's a small group where that's the case, but for most people who stalk, stalking is, fundamentally communicative. In most cases, what you're trying to do is you're trying to communicate something that you want to the victim. In most stalking cases, the stalker and the victim do know who each other are. Like they've known each other beforehand. They're not strangers. So that kind of idea of, the stranger kind of lurking in the bushes or perhaps online is actually very much the minority of these cases. Much more commonly, it's an ex-partner. A bit under half of cases are ex-partners or some sort of acquaintance, like someone you work with or someone you know through a social activity like a sports club or church or a neighbour, something like that.
So how would you actually define stalking to start with?
Well, stalking has kind of 3, maybe 4 key elements, right? So the first thing is it's a behaviour, okay? It's not a mental illness. It's just a behaviour. It's a thing people do. And it's defined by the fact that you're engaging in repeated behaviour. So I'm talking from the perspective of the person who's doing the stalking. Let's pretend I'm a stalker. And I engage in repeated acts where I'm imposing myself into another person's life where they don't want me. And my persistent behaviour leads to that other person feeling distressed, fearful, so negative kind of psychological consequences. So that's your 3 big kind of criteria. It's repeated, it's unwanted, and it causes some sort of psychological harm. The kind of arguably 4th criteria is the idea that it must be an imposition. So when you talk about stalking, it's really important to be clear that it's related to intimate partner abuse, and it occurs with intimate partner abuse. But whenever I'm talking about stalking, I'm talking about a behaviour that's happening outside of an ongoing relationship where the 2 people want to have contact. It's pushing yourself in where you're not legitimately allowed to be and you're not wanted. If you're actually going out with a person and you're monitoring and surveilling that person, that's obviously abusive. It's maybe coercive control. I wouldn't use the word stalking to describe that behaviour because I think it gets very confusing because stalking means something out in the world. And when we start talking about behaviours in relationships of stalking, it gets quite confusing because you assess risk differently. And so I try and keep a fairly, as clear as I can, it's not always 100%, but as clear as I can line between what is coercive control in a relationship and then what is stalking after the end of a relationship. And I fully acknowledge not everyone would agree with me on that, but that's something that I think is quite important as a practitioner because when I'm talking to people about managing risk and assessing risk in stalking cases, the things I'm looking for to say this case is higher risk of physical violence or it's higher risk of persisting, those are slightly different things if there's no voluntary contact between the people. Whereas if you're in a relationship, you might be living with a person, that's a really different risk assessment and risk management kind of setting. And I think it's helpful to kind of talk about them a little bit, not use the same language at least in the two contexts.
So is stalking per se a crime?
Yeah, absolutely. Stalking's been a crime right around the English-speaking world since early 1990s. So the first stalking law was passed in California in 1990. Australian states pretty much all had a stalking law by, I think, 1997. Pretty much all English-speaking jurisdictions and a lot of non-English-speaking jurisdictions that had close connections to English-speaking places like the Netherlands, Japan, these kind of countries, they all pretty much passed stalking laws in the 1990s. So it predates by quite a long way the idea of coercive control, which didn't kind of arise until maybe 15 years later. More recently, the stalking laws have kind of expanded, although there are still absolutely places in the world that don't have stalking laws. It is a culturally bound concept. So the idea that stalking is a form of interpersonal harm that requires legislation, that requires criminalisation, is something that has increased in the last 30 years, but there are absolutely still places where there's no stalking law. France, for example, doesn't have a stalking law. So when I started my career, it wasn't uncommon for me to have discussions. I'd do talks or whatever, and I remember talking to a Spanish person once and saying, "Oh, what do you do research in?" And I said, "Oh, I look at stalking." And they kind of looked at me and kind of had this odd expression and said, You hunt deer?" And I said, "No." Because at the time, Spain didn't have a concept of stalking in the way it does now. There's now research literature in Spain. So it's still a developing social construct. And that's really important to understand, that not everyone will have the same idea about what stalking is. And so when I'm working with people who stalk, one of my thoughts is always, hang on, what's this person's cultural background? Where are they coming from? What might be their kind of understanding of what this word actually means and what the idea is? Because sometimes that is very relevant to what's happened. Sometimes it's not, but sometimes it's very relevant.
I imagine coercive control is a similar cultural thing, and possibly religious as well, whether it's considered appropriate or inappropriate or a crime.
Absolutely. And so you get, in both stalking and coercive control, bearing in mind that, more than half of stalking isn't to do with intimate relationships, but in both stalking and coercive control, you see the rise of the kind of women's rights movements and women's liberation movement through the 1970s, driving political attention towards violence against women. And as part of that, the political attention towards stalking and then subsequently in more recent years towards coercive control is partly driven by political movements about violence against women. Stalking is slightly different. Stalking has this other kind of influence as well, which is the recognition of stalking kind of grew out of stalking of celebrities in the late 80s, early 90s. There was a couple of very high-profile homicides in California at the time, and those homicides, along with the stalking homicides of women killed by their former partners, together is what prompted that very first stalking law. And so it's always kind of had this dual kind of focus. Partly it's been attached to the intimate partner violence literature and talked about in that context, but there's a whole other research literature that I exist within, where stalking is seen as linked to intimate partner violence, but very much not just that, quotation marks, but very, very much not just that, but also this other kind of behaviour that's important to understand more broadly.
In terms of partner violence, former partner violence, family violence, what is the percentage of those cases that lead to death that have involved stalking?
That's a really great question, and so far there's one unpublished study that can answer that question. So we've just done it's a study that I've co-authored here in Australia, but it's currently getting reviewed by the journals. So I'll start off by talking about what's happened before, and then I'll maybe talk about that. So there's a lot of research that says that stalking is a risk factor for homicide. There's a few studies that have said that. It's a quite common thing that you will hear, and if you read death reviews, if you look at family violence policy, people will say stalking is a risk factor for homicide. And that comes out of research that's been done that basically with ex-partner stalkers. So they basically took a sample of women who'd been killed by their ex-partners, and they took a sample of women who had been abused but not killed by their ex-partners, and they compared those two samples and said, what's different between these samples? And what they found was that the sample of women who had been killed, they were more likely, their family and friends, or perhaps the women themselves before their death, were more likely to have reported stalking behaviour before the homicide than the women who were abused but not killed. And so from that, the people who did these studies, and there's 2 or 3 of them, concluded stalking is a thing that differentiates intimate partner homicide, or at least intimate partner homicide of women by men, from intimate partner violence that is not homicide. And that's completely legitimate. That's a really legitimate thing to conclude. The problem is that when you take that kind of finding and then say, well, that means stalking is a risk factor for homicide, it can predict homicide, there's a real problem because those studies are not predictive. They're just comparing 2 groups. And you're vastly overestimating the prevalence of homicide when you do that. Like they've got 500 homicides and 500 non-homicides, and they're saying stalking's different between them. Problem is, in reality, if you had a sample of 1,000 abused women, fewer than 1, probably none of them would be killed because homicide is so very rare. But stalking will be present in those 1,000 women. So basically what happens is stalking's present quite a lot, but it hardly ever predicts homicide. So it's not a very good risk factor. So when we look at big samples of women who are abused by an ex-partner, you see stalking behaviour not uncommonly. Okay, so there's a few studies, somewhere probably between roughly maybe 30 to 50% of women who have experienced abuse during a relationship will go on to be stalked after that relationship by their then ex-partner. Almost none of those women will suffer a fatal attack. They'll be killed. Almost none. It's so rare. So the stalking doesn't actually predict the homicide at all. When you look at it the other way around, when you look at all the homicides and you say, okay, all of these people, women and men, all these people have been killed, how often can we see stalking before the homicide? In all homicides, the work we've done here in Victoria suggests about 6% have evidence of stalking prior to the homicide. When you look just at ex-partners, in our work, it's about 63%. So when you look at homicide cases, stalking's really common amongst ex-partners. But when you look at stalking cases, homicide's really, really, really unusual. It's really easy to take those 2 numbers and kind of interpret the wrong way around, say, oh gosh, every time there's stalking, there's going to be a homicide. But actually, 99.9999999, add a few more nines, % of stalking cases, including ex-partner stalking cases, will not end in homicide. It's a kind of a tricky relationship to think about. You've got to look at it both ways. You can't just look at the homicides.
If you were mentioning that people who'd been murdered by ex-partners, for example, had reported stalking, you can wrongly assume that reporting is a higher risk for getting killed. So I hope that is totally inaccurate. Or you can also assume that the degree of severity is such that they feel compelled to report because they are genuinely in fear for their lives, and justifiably. There are so many things you can extrapolate, but it doesn't mean you're right. So is there a way of judging severity of stalking and equating that with risk?
Okay, so there's a few things in that kind of question. First, I really want to make clear that stalking's a problem even if it's not high risk of physical violence, because stalking itself is a real problem and it's massively harmful, can be massively harmful, regardless of whether it involves physical violence or not. So that's the kind of the first thing to just be really clear about, I think. Stalking that has certain characteristics, there are cases that are higher risk of physical violence. So there are various kinds of risk factors that people like me look for. The thing is that what predicts any physical violence is probably a little bit different to what predicts the potentially fatal violence or what's associated with fatal violence. So it's quite technical and difficult, and it's a really specialist area. And that's one of the challenges in this area with responding effectively to stalking, is that to respond well, you actually need quite a lot of detailed knowledge. And so having systems where cases can be looked at by people with the right kind of knowledge is kind of a key issue. And so again and again, when you see reviews of responses to stalking, whether that's in the wake of a homicide or whether it's a more general review of, we're not doing this very well, what can we do better? Inevitably, one of the things that comes out of those reviews is that people at the front line, whether that's police, whether it's victim safety advocates, whether it's, courts, these kinds of agencies, there needs to be kind of ways of pushing cases towards specialist assessment, so people who understand the nuance can actually look at it and try to make informed decisions, because expecting, officer blogs in every single police station in the country to have that level of detailed knowledge is, in my view at least, probably not realistic, because it's such a complicated, nuanced behaviour. What is important that officer blogs can do is that they can recognise the stalking in the first place. That's where the big problem is. It's the failure to recognise the stalking, because once you've recognised it, then you can have systems and you can have processes for responding and assessing risk and doing all those things.
Can you go through what the categories of stalking are?
So the first thing I'll say is that behaviourally, most stalking can look fairly similar. It kind of divides up into two broad things: angry, intimidating, threatening; desperate, loving, pleading. Okay, that's your kind of two versions, if you like, of as a victim. That's the kind of two things you might experience. But if you're looking at it from the other side and looking at why is the person actually engaging in the stalking, it gets a little bit more complex than that. So a useful way of thinking about it is thinking about the idea of motivation, or the kind of the function, if you like, of the stalking for the person. And in that context, typically we talk about kind of 5 different groups of motivations. They're not completely mutually exclusive probably, but it's a helpful way of kind of just organising your thinking, basically. So the first group people tend to think about your rejected ex-partners. Yeah, so they make up they're a big single group, probably the largest group by themselves. And so they're people who their stalking begins after the end of a breakdown of a relationship, usually an intimate relationship, but potentially also maybe like an estrangement in the family or an estranged friend, breakdown of a friendship. You could get rejection after that. Even in some cases, a very close therapeutic relationship. We've had a long-standing therapeutic relationship with a doctor, a psychiatrist, psychologist, this kind of thing, and that breaks down and the person feels rejected. But the bulk of that group is an intimate sexual relationship. And it breaks down, and one person usually doesn't want it to have ended, or alternatively they are so hurt by the ending that they decide to take revenge, if you like, on the ex-partner. I need to hurt you the way you've hurt me. And so quite often in that group, the stalking actually almost becomes like a substitute for the relationship for those people. They're enacting the relationship on their ex-partner, even though their ex-partner doesn't want to have anything to do with them. And so that's a really tricky kind of situation. And often it flips between this desperate, pleading, loving, I just want to say sorry, I just want you back, I just want us to be back together, it was so perfect. And then when the other person doesn't do what they want, then angry, threatening, intimidating, and then, oh, I'm sorry I did that. And you get this kind of flipping in the emotional kind of presentation. So that's kind of the biggest group. And I think that's probably the group a lot of people think about when they think about stalking. They think of these ex-partners who are kind of targeting they're usually men targeting women. The next two groups are both at the other end of the relationship kind of continuum, if you like. So they're seeking a relationship. They haven't had a relationship with the victim, but they want one. So the first group is what we call in my field the people who are incompetent suitors. So basically they're going about trying to get a relationship, but they don't have the skills to do that in a way that's socially acceptable. And so they do things that are frightening and that scare the person they're trying to initiate that relationship with. And so often in this group, they are people who desperately want to have connection with another person. They're lonely. They would like to have what all their peers have, which is meaningful, intimate relationships, but they kind of just don't get how you should do that. And maybe also they're someone who's not very appealing, so they're not going to be very successful in relationships, in establishing relationships. And so they do experience a lot of kind of knockbacks, but they're not able for various reasons. Often people in this group have various, neurodevelopmental kind of issues, like intellectual disability, autism spectrum, these kinds of things. That's not causing them to stalk by any means, but it means that they've not necessarily got the skills and they're not responding well to that situation. And so in the process, they're frightening usually the women that they're trying to start relationships with. So they're a small group, but they're probably more common out there in the world than we see, because I'm guessing it probably happens quite a lot, but just doesn't get reported.
Do they tend to repeat offend as well?
Yeah, that group
to target
does
more than one person.
That's right. Yeah, so we know that from literature that group does tend to, because it's not. Most stalking is very much about this victim. So if I'm stalking someone, it's about that person and what they're doing and what they mean to me. It's very much about the dyad and the relationship. The people who are stalking in that kind of incompetent way, it's more about what that person represents. They're an opportunity to have a date, maybe to have a sexual contact. And so when they're rejected, they don't persist for that long. They'll go for a few days, a few weeks, and then eventually they'll stop. They'll realise, oh, hang on, this isn't working. They're getting really clear signals. They might be getting police involvement. They'll back off, but then that same need is there, so they'll find someone else who meets that same need, but they go through the same process. So you get this kind of repeated pattern with different people. So the other group that's trying to seek a relationship, we call intimacy-seeking stalkers. So they are people usually who've got fairly significant mental health problems, and they often actually believe there is a relationship already. So that can be because they've actually got like a delusional belief. They actually genuinely believe that they have a relationship with that person, and the stalking is actually just them having the relationship. I remember very early in my career, I was observing my supervisor at the time doing an assessment, and we're sitting in the room, and this person was talking about, what had happened, and if someone's coming to see me, that's generally not a good sign. Something's gone fairly significantly wrong in their life that they get to see me. So I was confused. I was a student. I was like, why are we seeing this person? They seem completely fine. I don't understand what's happening. And they were talking about their wife. They were talking about, and what they've been doing with their wife. And then my supervisor kind of said, oh, and who's your wife? And I won't say who the celebrity was because I don't want to give that away, but it was someone who's very, very high profile. That person's parents live in Melbourne, and what they've been doing was going around to their parents-in-law's house to see their partner. They were not married to that celebrity. That celebrity lives a very long way away and is definitely not married to the person I saw. But they genuinely, their understanding of the world was that they were in a loving relationship with that celebrity. And so the stalking was actually stalking the celebrity's parents because that person thought that those people were their parents-in-law. So that's, very obviously very unwell person who needs assistance and psychiatric help because their behaviour and their world is not kind of rational. And then you get other people in that group who maybe aren't so overtly unwell or are unwell in different ways, but it's in a similar sense. They stalk because they believe they have this relationship, or maybe they could have this relationship if just the person knew them a little bit more. So your most classic example of this, very famous example, is a man who shot Ronald Reagan, so the US president.
For Jodie Foster.
Yeah, exactly. And so this man, he shot Ronald Reagan not because he had anything particular against the president, it would seem, but he had a fixation on Jodie Foster, and he believed that if Jodie Foster just became aware of who he was, she would then inevitably fall in love with him as he was with her, and then they could be together. And so he, in his way of thinking, came to the conclusion the quickest way of becoming famous was to shoot the president. And so that's what led him to shoot the president. So he was stalking Jodie Foster, but the shooting of the president was actually a way of getting her to notice him.
There's another one too, I think, where someone stabbed Monica Seles, a tennis player.
Yes. Yeah, and that was stalking Steffi Graf. And he was trying to get Monica Seles out of the way. He perceived Monica Seles as a threat to Steffi Graf's supremacy in tennis, and he was desperately in love with Steffi Graf in a pathological way. And so he stabbed Monica Seles in a kind of attempt to almost enact his love for Steffi Graf kind of thing. So that exactly, another very kind of famous case. And then there are other cases that are not motivated so much by love, but you see similar kinds of, seriously violent acts in an attempt to kind of attract attention to things, whether that's to a personal cause or just notoriety. The man who killed John Lennon, for example, had been stalking him for some time beforehand, and he killed John Lennon to become famous. So those are our first three. So rejected ex-partners, incompetent suitors, intimacy seekers. And then there's two more, and they're quite different. So they're not relational in that sense. The first one is people who we call resentful stalkers. They're also sometimes referred to as being driven by grievance. So these are people who It's nothing to do with intimacy. It's just nothing to do with that. It's to do with the perception that they've been mistreated by the person who they're stalking, or at least by something that person represents. Sometimes it might be a company or something like that, or that poor victim is just the last person in a long line of people they feel have mistreated them and they're just the one that they chose to focus on. But they feel mistreated, and the stalking is an effort to take retribution, to even the score, to receive acknowledgement, and the kind of satisfaction that comes from feeling like you have power and you've got a say and you've got a voice and people are listening and paying attention to you when you usually don't feel that way. So the resentful stalkers, they're a significant group. We see them in all sorts of contexts. So sometimes they're people who are making vexatious complaints to professional bodies, for example, towards doctors and these kinds of things. They might be using the courts to litigate in ways that are vexatious. They might be people who are writing awful reviews online about professionals that aren't true. They might be the people you see, standing outside a government department with a sandwich board saying these people did this thing to me and everyone needs to know about it. They're driven by a sense of grievance and a sense of injustice, and the stalking is an attempt to right that wrong. And in some cases, that's pathological, so it's driven by mental disorder, or they actually develop a mental illness over time as their focus on this becomes more and more fixed and everything else falls away. And sometimes it's more just it's something they do on the side. It's not that kind of central fixation, but nonetheless, it's something they do that is a big part of their life, and they see this injustice as being kind of a core thing they have to right, and so they will keep pursuing it.
Do they need to have met the person or have some contact with that person?
Usually, yes. I mean, stalking that persists for any amount of time is usually pretty personal. There's a sense of this is important to who I am and to my sense of who I am. You've done something to me. It might be that you represent something that has done something to me. So I've never met you, but you're a member of the council that did something to my house. So I don't know you personally, but you represent that organisation that is the thing that maltreated me, right? But so it's always got that personal element. And it might be the victim can't see what that personal element is, but for the person stalking, it is personal. It's about them. And this is, I think, the really important thing that differentiates stalking from something like trolling online. It's really intensely important to people who do this. It's tied up in their sense of self and their sense of who they are. You never, ever, I've never met a single person in my life who is stalked who feels indifferent about the victim. The victim is very important to them. And that's something I think people don't quite understand, because the behaviours can look quite similar on the outside, but what's driving those behaviours is really quite different. And the level of intense emotion that's kind of drives persistent stalking is quite a thing when you see it.
If it's not just about righting a wrong, are they determined to inflict pain or similar pain on the person they're stalking? Yeah,
I think it varies. Broadly, it's more seen usually about righting a wrong, a perceived wrong. Doesn't mean that isn't actually wrong, but a perceived wrong. But very commonly when I talk to people who've got this kind of motivation, that does bleed into at some point, but they've harmed me and so they need to be taken down a peg or two. And so you do see the resentful group are quite threatening, like they'll make explicit threats. So the ex-partners, the rejected ex-partners and the resentful kind of grievance-fueled stalkers, they're the most overtly threatening stalkers. They will say things that I'm going to kill you, you need to look out, I know where your kids go to school, these kinds of things. And that's partly because they're trying to scare. Part of what they're doing is trying to scare the victim. That's not the case with people who are trying to start a relationship. They don't want to scare the victim. They want a relationship with the victim, right? So it's very different kind of function for that person. So the stalking as a consequence will look different. When I say those things, I don't mean to imply that it's all kind of completely Machiavellian and completely planned out. Sometimes it is. Very often it's like, things get, people are saying things in the heat of the moment, and they're people who don't have good communication strategies and they make threats outside of the stalking and they do awful things outside of the stalking, and that's how they are and when they stalk. For the resentful, it's usually a little bit more kind of thought through, in my experience at least. People who resentfully stalk generally are, as a group, less antisocial. They don't have other offences. You get people who resentfully stalk who this is just the thing that they've done. They don't do other kinds of crime. They just do this. And quite often, I remember quite a few clients I've seen who would fall into this group. They're actually very moral people. They're people who have a very strong sense of what's right and what's wrong. And that's actually part of the issue, right? Because when they perceive that they've been wronged, they can't let it go. They can't kind of say, this is something I'm just going to have to work around or find a different way of feeling about, because that they're so moralistic and kind of black and white that when that rule has been broken, they have to then police it. They have to make the other person understand that you've done something wrong and you can't do that to me.
You can't get away with it.
Exactly. And very often when you get really kind of very problematic, resentful stalkers, not only can you not do that to me and you can't get away with it, I'm going to hold you to account so you can't do that to other people. So their cause becomes linked to a wider sense of righteousness. And so quite often you see with resentful stalkers, you'll see this point at which, it's what I call kind of mushrooming. You kind of get the initial complaint or the initial grievance is here, and then bloop, it kind of grows and a new grievance comes on because someone else has gone by bloop, 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 and it just kind of extends out. Everything becomes caught up in it and attached to it, and they'll see more reasons for grievance beyond. So even if the original thing got resolved, there's now 5 other things that have happened in the meantime that they need to fix.
That sounds more like a conspiracy mentality.
It's a really interesting observation, I think, because there are, I think, some similarities. It's usually quite a personal cause. So that's, I think, a difference. It's not usually a shared kind of cause, although there are things that do drive stalking that are common. So men's rights, kind of parents' rights stuff and that's a shared kind of set of beliefs around how courts work and how the family law system works and these kinds of things that can move from being legitimate, complaint and upset into more illegitimate beliefs and kind of less rational beliefs around what's going on. But more commonly, the causes that drive resentful stalking are quite personalised and kind of idiosyncratic. And so they kind of feel a little bit like conspiracy in terms of the process, but usually it's not caught up in a wider conspiracy, in my experience anyway.
They see themselves as a crusader, perhaps.
100%. Self-righteous crusading. That's what this group is like. And there's a certain similarity with a subgroup of ex-partners, particularly people who get into a situation where they feel they've got a right, usually around children and access and custody to children. They can actually move kind of into that group. They look quite similar to that resentful group because the stalking's not really about the relationship with the ex so much, although it still is. But it also takes on this self-righteous crusading kind of aspect of I have a right to see my children. They're mine and I have a right to those children regardless of what anybody says. And so that crusading kind of element can come into it.
And what's the last type of stalking behaviour, the last group?
So the last group are the smallest group, and they're also a group that's a little bit controversial. Some people would suggest that maybe this isn't stalking. I disagree. The last group are people who stalk as part of a kind of pattern of deviant sexual behaviour. So their stalking is usually part of a pattern that either is preparatory or part of a sequence of behaviours preparing for a sexual assault. So, the identifying a victim, following, monitoring that victim, maybe breaking into their house, doing things, that kind of thing. Or maybe not a sexual assault, but, some sort of other deviant sexual behaviour like voyeurism. So they target a particular victim and they watch that person. They engage in sexual behaviour while watching that person. Yeah. So the reason some people think this is kind of controversial to call this stalking is because this group typically isn't known to the victim. So the victim wouldn't be aware that they're being stalked, or if they are, it's more of a sense of, something's not quite right here. So the predatory stalker, which is what we've called this group, it is the one group where it's really not about communicating with the victim. It's about the victim represents something, and the stalking is part of a pattern of behaviour designed to help them receive sexual gratification. That's basically what's going on. So the stalking itself is exciting and arousing. It's not just logistical. It's not just finding out where the person is and finding out. It's actually in itself quite exciting. It has an emotional component, but it's got this real sexual element as well. So the reason we would include this in stalking is because quite frequently you don't actually get to the sexual assault. Things are picked up earlier, and behaviourally it's pretty much the same as the other cases that can look very, very similar, just without the direct communication. And also we work on a premise of if the person knew this was happening, they would be very distressed. And so therefore that we would say that that would meet the criteria for stalking. We use a similar kind of thing when you talk about celebrities who are being stalked or high profile people. For example, I've done some work in the past, I do some work with the people who do threat assessment protection stuff for the British royal family. We have equivalent kinds of 8 units here in Australia, but the Queen was one of the most stalked people in the world. She didn't know that most of the time, unless they broke into her bedroom and sat in her bed, but most of the time she didn't know that. But you wouldn't say the people who were targeting her weren't stalking her, even though she wasn't aware of that, because of course her security people knew about it and they were concerned and they were doing things. And so I think if we're going to say that about a public figure, I'm of the view that we should say that about people in the world as well, where if the police found out that this person's going to someone's house and looking in their room and working out how to break in to sexually assault them, the police would be pretty concerned by that. And so I think that's probably legitimate to call that stalking, even though a sexual assault hasn't happened.
That sounds totally fair to me, but also just historically, voyeurism and watching and breaking in and that often is a type of behaviour that will escalate to sexual assault as well.
It can do. It's a little bit like what I was saying before with the homicide stalking thing. Lots of people are voyeurs who will never sexually assault, but lots of people who sexually assault strangers have previously engaged in voyeurism. So it's one of these tricksy things where it's common amongst the people who assault, but just being a voyeur doesn't necessarily mean you're high risk of sexually assaulting someone. It's a tricky thing that I think people underestimate how common, unfortunately, these behaviours are, and they really are very common. And stranger sexual assault is, thankfully, actually quite uncommon.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a LiSTNR original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and is produced by Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.